Hello and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. In the autumn of 1095, an aging man stood in a field in southern France and spoke for less than an hour. He had no army, no crown, and no money to offer. Yet within 4 years, tens of thousands of people from across Europe had sold their homes, sewn cloth crosses onto their cloaks, and walked more than 2,000 miles toward a city most of them had only heard about in church. Many would die of thirst, of fever, or of arrows in lands they could not name, and what waited for them at the end would be remembered and argued over for nearly 1,000 years. Before we go further, if you find something calming in these long, slow histories, you might like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. There is no need otherwise. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It is a quiet, pleasant thing to know that someone in another city, in another hour of the night, is settling in to hear the same story you are. So make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, rest your head, and let yourself drift as we go back to the beginning of the First Crusade. To understand how it began, we have to set aside the idea of a single, united Christian world. In the 11th century there was no such thing. There were 2 great Christian civilizations, and they did not much like each other. In the west lay the lands we would now call France, Germany, Italy, and England. These were a patchwork of small kingdoms, dukedoms, and counties, ruled by knights who fought one another constantly over land, honour, and old grudges. Latin was the language of their church. Their bishop in Rome, the Pope, claimed authority over them all, though kings often ignored him. Far to the east stood the other Christian power, and it was a different creature entirely. This was the Byzantine Empire, ruled from the enormous, wealthy, walled city of Constantinople. The people there did not call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans, because that is what they were. Their empire was the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, the part that had never fallen. While Rome in the west had collapsed centuries earlier, Constantinople had survived, with its emperors, its Greek-speaking scholars, its golden churches, and its memory of an unbroken line back to the Caesars. To a rough knight from the French countryside, Constantinople was almost unimaginable. It held more people than any western city, more gold, more books, and walls so strong that no enemy had broken through them in 700 years. But by the time our story opens, this old and proud empire was in serious trouble, and the trouble had a name. From the east had come the Seljuk Turks, a people who had swept out of Central Asia, converted to Islam, and built a powerful empire of their own across Persia and the Near East. They were superb horsemen and archers, and they pressed hard against the Byzantine frontier in the region we now call Turkey, which was then called Anatolia or Asia Minor. For the Romans of Constantinople, Anatolia was not some distant border, it was the heartland. It was where they raised their soldiers, grew their grain, and collected much of their wealth. The disaster that broke the empire's grip on that heartland came in the year 1071, at a place called Manzikert, near the eastern edge of Anatolia. The Byzantine emperor of the day, Romanos IV, marched out with a large army to drive the Turks back for good. Instead, through bad luck, poor coordination, and treachery among his own commanders, his army was shattered. The emperor himself was captured alive on the battlefield, which was an almost unheard of humiliation for a Roman ruler. The Turkish Sultan, to his credit, treated the captured emperor with courtesy and released him. His own people were far less gracious. When Romanos finally made his way home, his political rivals had him blinded, which was a fairly permanent way of settling the question of who should be in charge. With the emperor disgraced and the leadership in chaos, the defence of Anatolia simply fell apart. Over the next 20 years, the Turks did not so much conquer the region as wander into it. Byzantine generals fighting each other for the throne actually invited Turkish warbands in as allies, paying them with land and letting them settle. town by town, valley by valley, the heartland slipped away. By the 1080s, Turkish rulers held cities only a short ride from Constantinople itself. A Turkish prince had set up his capital at Nicaea, a city so close to the imperial throne that the emperor could practically feel its breath on his neck. Into this collapse stepped the man whose decision would set everything in motion. His name was Alexios Komnenos, and he was, by the standards of the time, a brilliant survivor. He came from a powerful military family. He was clever, patient, and endlessly willing to bargain, flatter, or bribe his way out of danger. In the year 1081, he seized the throne in yet another coup, becoming Emperor Alexios I. He inherited an empire that was bleeding from every side. The Turks pressed from the east. A fierce people called the Pechenegs raided from the north. And from the west came the Normans, those restless adventurers from northern France who had already conquered England and southern Italy, and who now eyed Byzantine territory with open hunger. Alexios was a realist. He knew his empire could no longer raise the huge armies of farmer soldiers it once had, because the land that fed those armies was now in Turkish hands. So he did what Byzantine emperors had always done best. He looked for someone else to do the fighting. For centuries, Constantinople had hired foreign mercenaries, paying gold to whoever could swing a sword. The empire's own elite palace guard, the famous Varangians, were mostly Scandinavians, and, increasingly, Englishmen who had fled their homeland after the Norman conquest. So when Alexios began to think about recovering his lost lands, he naturally turned his eyes westward, to the one place that seemed to produce an endless supply of aggressive, heavily armed, and frankly underemployed young fighting men. Those western knights were a problem looking for a place to happen. The custom of the age was that a nobleman's lands passed to his eldest son. Younger sons inherited little but a horse, a sword, and a temper. With no land of their own, many spent their lives fighting for hire, feuding with neighbours, or simply causing trouble. The Church had spent decades trying to calm them down, with movements like the Peace of God, which attempted, with mixed results, to forbid knights from attacking priests, peasants, and one another on holy days. Western Europe, in short, had a surplus of warriors and not nearly enough wars to keep them busy. Alexios, sitting in Constantinople, saw not a problem but a resource. And so, in the early months of 1095, the emperor sent ambassadors on the long journey west. They carried a request to the head of the Latin Church, asking for soldiers. We do not know the exact words they used, and historians still debate how large or how specific the request really was. The most likely truth is modest. Alexios wanted what emperors before him had wanted, a few thousand professional mercenaries he could pay, command, and send home when the job was done. He wanted manageable help to recover manageable amounts of land. He was a man who liked to keep careful control of every situation, and he had every intention of controlling this one too. His ambassadors reached the Pope while the Church was holding a great council in the northern Italian town of Piacenza in March of 1095. There, before a large gathering of clergy, the Byzantine envoys made their appeal. They spoke of Christians in the East suffering under the Turks, of holy places falling into the hands of strangers, and of the danger pressing against the gates of the old Christian empire. They asked for fighting men to come to the aid of their fellow believers. The Pope listened. And here is where the story turns, because the man who received that request was not interested in quietly arranging a small mercenary contract. He had ideas of his own, ideas far larger and far stranger than anything Alexios had imagined. The emperor had asked for a tool. What he would eventually receive, marching toward his city in numbers no one could control, would be something closer to a flood. But that flood began with a single voice, raised a few months later, in a field in France, and to that voice, and the words that lit the fire, we now turn. The man who held that request in his hands was named Odo, though history remembers him by the name he took as Pope, Urban II. He was French by birth, born to a noble family in the north, and he had spent his early career as a monk at Cluny, the most famous and most disciplined monastery in Europe. Cluny was the beating heart of a movement to reform the church, to scrub it clean of corruption, of bishops who bought their offices, of priests who lived like local lords. Urban had risen through that movement, served as a trusted assistant to an earlier reforming pope, and absorbed its conviction that the church should lead Christendom, not merely bless it. When Urban became pope in 1088, he inherited a fight that had nearly destroyed his predecessors. The popes of his generation were locked in a bitter struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in the West, over a simple but explosive question: who had the right to appoint bishops, the Pope or the Emperor? This quarrel, which historians call the investiture controversy, had grown so vicious that the Emperor had once driven the Pope out of Rome and set up a rival pope of his own. For a time, Urban could not even safely live in his own city. He governed a divided, embattled church from the road, moving through Italy and France, building alliances, looking for some way to restore the authority and the prestige of his office. So when the Byzantine ambassadors came asking for soldiers, Urban did not hear a small administrative problem. He heard an opportunity unlike any other. Here was a chance to turn the restless, violent energy of Europe's knights away from one another and toward a cause the church itself would direct. Here was a way to reunite the eastern and western branches of Christianity, which had formally split apart only 40 years earlier, and to do it with the Pope, not the Emperor, standing at the centre of the Christian world. The request from the East was a spark. What Urban built around it was something far larger than Alexios had ever wanted. Through the summer and autumn of 1095, Urban travelled across France, his homeland, holding councils and gathering support. The great gathering came in late November at Clermont, in the region of Auvergne in central France. For more than a week, hundreds of bishops and abbots met to discuss church business, the usual matters of reform and discipline. But everyone sensed that the Pope had something more in mind. On the final days, he announced that he would deliver a public address, and that this one was not only for the clergy. Word went out, and people came, knights and townsfolk and farmers, far too many to fit inside any church. So a platform was built in an open field outside the city, and there, on a cold day late in November of 1095, Urban climbed up to speak. We do not know exactly what he said. This is one of the strange truths at the centre of the whole story. The single most influential speech of the Middle Ages survives only in versions written down years later by men who were trying to remember, or who were not even there. Several of these accounts exist, and they disagree on the details, because each writer shaped the speech to fit what the crusade had since become. What they agree on is the general thrust. Urban told the crowd that their fellow Christians in the East were suffering terribly under the Turks. He described, in vivid and likely exaggerated terms, churches defiled, pilgrims robbed and murdered, holy places desecrated. He reminded them that Jerusalem, the city where Christ had lived and died, lay in the hands of unbelievers. Then he made his great appeal. He called on the knights of the West to stop spilling one another's blood in petty feuds and to turn their swords instead to a holy purpose. He urged them to march east, to aid their eastern brethren, and to liberate Jerusalem, and he offered something extraordinary in return. Any man who went, not for gain or glory but out of devotion, would receive a remission of his sins. The journey itself would count as a complete penance, wiping away the punishment owed for a lifetime of wrongdoing. For a society soaked in the fear of damnation, for hardened fighting men who had killed and sinned and lived in dread of the judgment to come, this was the most powerful offer imaginable. Urban was telling them that the very skill they had been told was sinful, the skill of war, could now become the path to salvation. The response, by every account, was overwhelming. The crowd is said to have broken into a roar, a cry that became the slogan of the whole enterprise. In their Latin and their rough French, it came out as God wills it. People surged forward to pledge themselves on the spot. a cardinal fell to his knees and begged to be the first to take the vow. And as a sign of their oath, those who pledged were given strips of cloth to sew in the shape of a cross onto their clothing. From this single gesture comes a word we still use, because the people who took that cross were, in the Latin of the Church, signed with the cross. The word crusade itself did not yet exist. Nobody at Clermont called themselves a crusader. They spoke instead of taking the journey, or going on pilgrimage, or simply taking the cross. The grand name we use came centuries later. To them it was a holy march, and a kind of armed pilgrimage no one had ever quite attempted before. Urban was no mere preacher swept up in the moment. He was a careful organizer, and he had clearly planned the practical side. He set a departure date for the following year, the Feast of the Assumption in the middle of August of 1096, sensibly after the harvest, so that armies would have food to carry. He appointed a leader to represent him on the expedition, a respected and capable nobleman bishop named Adhemar of Le Puy, who would serve as the Pope's own deputy and try to hold the whole unruly venture together. Urban also tried to set limits on who should go. He discouraged the old, the sick, and the unfit. He told monks they needed their abbots' permission and priests their bishops. He warned that this was not a venture for those merely seeking adventure or escape from debt. He wanted soldiers, organised and supplied, marching under proper leaders. What he got was something rather different and far beyond his control. After Clermont, Urban spent months touring France, preaching the message again and again, and the idea caught fire in a way that no medieval institution could manage. Letters and rumours raced ahead of him. Wandering preachers, some authorised and many not, took up the call and carried it into towns and villages where the Pope's careful conditions were forgotten or never heard. The message simplified as it spread, from a complex appeal to aid the Eastern Church into a single thrilling promise: march to Jerusalem, fight the enemies of God, and win heaven. It is worth pausing on how strange this was. The Emperor Alexios, sitting in Constantinople, had asked for a modest band of mercenaries to help him reclaim some farmland in Anatolia. He had said nothing about Jerusalem, which was hundreds of miles beyond any territory he hoped to recover, and which had been in Muslim hands, peacefully enough for pilgrims, for more than 4 centuries. Yet within a year, his quiet request had grown into a continent-wide movement aimed at a city he had not even mentioned. The enthusiasm spread fastest among exactly the people Urban had tried to discourage. Long before the great lords had finished gathering their knights and selling their estates to fund the march, before any organised army was ready to move, the message had reached the poor, the desperate, and the simple faithful of northern France and the Rhineland. They did not wish to wait until August. They did not understand that an expedition of this size needed money, supplies, and seasoned commanders. They heard only that God willed it, and that Jerusalem was waiting. And so the very first people to set out on the road to the Holy Land would not be armoured knights on war horses, but a vast, ragged, and dangerously hopeful crowd, led by a barefoot preacher on a donkey. Their journey would come first, and it would end in catastrophe. The People's Crusade. The man who lit the fuse among the common people was not a bishop or a baron, but a small, shabby, intense preacher named Peter the Hermit. He came from the region of Amiens in northern France, and by the accounts of those who saw him, he was an unforgettable figure. He was short and dark, dressed in a coarse woolen cloak, and he travelled on a donkey, eating little, going barefoot. He had a gift that all the careful planning of the Pope could not match. He could move a crowd to tears and then to action. Wherever he went, through northern France and into the German lands of the Rhineland, people pressed around him to touch his cloak or pull a hair from his donkey as a holy relic. He told them that God had called them, all of them, and that they need not wait for armoured lords or appointed dates. The road to Jerusalem was open now. The crowd that gathered around him was unlike any army the world had seen. There were a few real knights and minor lords, men like Walter, who carried the unfortunate nickname sans avoir, meaning without possessions, which history kindly renders as Walter the Penniless. But most of those who followed Peter were ordinary people. There were farmers who had sold their tools, tradesmen who had abandoned their shops, women, children, the elderly, the poor, and a fair number of the simply desperate, all swept up in the conviction that the end of the world might be near and that Jerusalem was the place to be when it came. They had little money, almost no supplies, and only the haziest notion of how far away the Holy Land actually was. There is a story, very likely true to the spirit of the thing, that children on the march would point at every large town they passed and ask whether this, at last, was Jerusalem. Before this enormous, unruly mass ever left Western Europe, it produced the first great tragedy of the Crusade, and one of the darkest episodes in European history. As bands of this popular movement formed across the Rhineland in the spring of 1096, some of their leaders, most infamously a German count named Emico, turned a terrible logic on their own neighbours. They asked why they should travel thousands of miles to fight the enemies of Christ abroad, while what they regarded as enemies of Christ lived in the towns around them. They meant the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, settled and prosperous in cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz and Cologne. What followed was a series of massacres. Thousands of Jewish men, women and children were killed by these mobs, offered the impossible choice of conversion or death. In several cities, the local bishops tried to shelter the Jews behind their own walls, sometimes at real personal risk, and sometimes those defences held and sometimes they were overwhelmed. The Church had never called for any such thing. The Pope's appeal had been aimed eastward, but the violence had been unleashed, and it could not be aimed where its preachers wished. It was an early and bitter sign of what happens when religious passion is set loose without control, and the Jewish communities of the Rhineland would remember it for generations. The main body of the People's Crusade, meanwhile, set off down the long road that armies and pilgrims had used for centuries, the route through Central Europe along the Danube toward Constantinople. This took them through the Kingdom of Hungary and the Byzantine Balkans, and almost at once the basic problem of the venture revealed itself. A crowd of many thousands, with no supply train and no money, has to eat. When the locals would not sell them enough food, or could not, the Crusaders simply took it. Crops were stripped, livestock seized, and tempers flared into open violence. At several towns along the way, what began as an argument over a market price ended as a pitched battle, with the pilgrims storming the place and the local garrison cutting them down in return. By the time the survivors staggered toward Constantinople in the high summer of 1096, they had already lost a great many of their number, not to Turks, but to hunger, disease, and the people whose lands they were supposedly marching to save. When this ragged horde arrived outside his walls, the Emperor Alexios faced exactly the problem he had feared, though in a form he had never imagined. He had asked for disciplined mercenaries. What had turned up was a vast camp of starving civilians and the occasional knight, with Peter the Hermit at their head, all of them hungry, excitable, and prone to looting whatever was not nailed down. Alexios, ever the careful manager, did the sensible thing. He sent them gifts and money. He gave Peter an audience, and then he arranged with all possible speed to ferry the entire crowd across the narrow strait of the Bosphorus and out of his city onto the Asian shore. He warned them, firmly, to wait there for the great armies of knights that were still gathering far behind them, and not to provoke the Turks on their own. It was excellent advice. It was almost entirely ignored. On the Asian side, the discipline that had never really existed broke down completely. The Crusaders raided the surrounding countryside, which now belonged to the Turkish Sultanate of Rum, and was ruled by a young and capable sultan named Kilij Arslan. They quarrelled among themselves, splitting into rival groups, one largely French and one largely German and Italian, each eager to outdo the other. Some raided right up to the walls of the Sultan's capital at Nicaea. One group seized a small fortress, only to be surrounded by Turkish forces, who offered them the choice of conversion or death and then killed most of them anyway. Peter the Hermit, watching his followers ignore every warning and drift toward catastrophe, gave up trying to control them and sailed back across to Constantinople to plead for help and supplies. He was, as it happened, absent for the disaster he had spent months building toward. In October of 1096, the end came. A rumour swept the Crusader camp that the German and Italian band had captured Nicaea itself and was dividing the loot. Furious at being left out, the rest of the host poured out of their camp at a place called Civitot on the road toward the city, marching in no order, with the old and the women and children trailing along behind the fighting men. Kilij Arslan had been waiting. His horse archers fell upon the strung-out column and shattered it almost at once. The Crusaders were driven back in a rout, run down, and slaughtered in their thousands. Some fled to the camp and made a last stand there. A few hundred reached an old ruined castle by the sea and held out until they could be rescued by ships from Constantinople. Most of the rest were killed or taken as slaves. The People's Crusade, which had set out tens of thousands strong, certain that God walked beside them, had effectively ceased to exist within months of leaving home, without ever coming close to Jerusalem. For Kilij Arslan the victory was complete and easy, and it taught him a lesson that would prove dangerously wrong. He had faced the warriors of the West, smashed them with little effort, and concluded that these crusaders were a disorganized rabble, brave perhaps, but no real threat to his power. It was a reasonable judgment based on the evidence in front of him. It was also a conclusion he would have a great deal of time, later, to reconsider, because the people he had just destroyed were not the army the Pope had summoned. They were the flood that had run ahead of it. Peter the Hermit survived. He would eventually rejoin the proper crusade and march on toward Jerusalem with the lords, a diminished figure now, no longer the man who could command a continent's poor with a wave of his hand, but present at the end all the same. The bones of his followers lay in heaps on the Anatolian shore, and Greek sailors who passed by in later months reported that the Turks had piled them into a grim wall, a marker of the place where the first wave of the crusade had broken. And yet, while these thousands died for nothing they would ever see, the real expedition was at last taking shape behind them. Through that same year, across France, Germany and Italy, the great lords had been doing the slow and expensive work that the poor had been too impatient to wait for. They were mortgaging castles, selling estates, gathering knights and foot soldiers and wagons of supplies, and binding themselves to the long march east. They were men of a wholly different order from Peter and his barefoot pilgrims, princes with armies, ambitions and rivalries of their own. It is to those men, and to the world that produced them, that the story now turns. The lords take the cross. The men who answered the Pope's call in earnest were a very different sort from Peter and his barefoot crowds. They were the warrior aristocracy of Europe, the great dukes and counts and their followings of mounted knights, and they came with money, with armies, and with ambitions that ran in many directions at once. It is worth noting that not one reigning king joined the First Crusade. The King of France, Philip I, had been excommunicated by the Pope over a scandalous marriage and was in no position to lead a holy war. The German Emperor, Henry IV, was the Pope's bitter enemy in their long quarrel. The King of England had no interest at all. So the leadership fell to the next rank down, the most powerful noblemen of the age, and there were several of them, each accustomed to being obeyed, and none accustomed to obeying anyone else. Foremost in wealth and prestige was Raymond of Saint-Gilles, the Count of Toulouse, who ruled much of southern France. He was the oldest of the leaders, somewhere past 50, experienced, devout and proud. He had already fought Muslims in Spain, he was enormously rich, and he announced that he was taking the cross for good, vowing never to return home. He brought his wife with him and clearly expected to be recognized as the chief commander of the whole enterprise. Travelling in his company was Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the Pope's own representative, which only strengthened Raymond's sense that he was meant to lead. From the German-speaking lands came Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin. Godfrey was a tall, fair, famously pious man, well regarded as a soldier, though not as politically cunning as some of his rivals. To fund his expedition, he did what almost all of them did. He raised cash by selling and mortgaging his lands and rights, stripping his estates to buy the horses, weapons and supplies that a campaign required. His younger brother Baldwin was a sharper, more calculating sort, a man with little land of his own and a clear eye for the main chance, and Baldwin would prove to be one of the most consequential figures of the whole affair. The most dangerous and capable of the leaders, at least in the judgment of the Byzantines, was Bohemond of Taranto. He was a Norman from southern Italy, the son of Robert Guiscard, a famous adventurer who had carved out a kingdom in Sicily and southern Italy and had spent years trying to conquer Byzantine territory. Bohemond himself had fought the Emperor Alexios before, on the losing side, and the two men knew and distrusted each other thoroughly. He was huge, charismatic, brilliant, and utterly self-interested, a man who saw in the crusade above all an opportunity to win himself a principality in the East. With him came his nephew Tancred, a young, energetic, and equally ambitious knight. From the north came others. Robert, the Duke of Normandy, was the eldest son of William the Conqueror, a brave and likeable man but a poor manager of his own affairs. To raise money for the journey, he mortgaged the entire Duchy of Normandy to his younger brother, the King of England, for 10,000 marks of silver, which gives some sense of what these men were willing to stake on the venture. Robert, the Count of Flanders, joined as well, a seasoned warrior whose father had served the Byzantine Emperor. And there was Stephen of Blois, one of the richest men in France, married to a daughter of William the Conqueror, a cultured and somewhat reluctant crusader who would write home long, vivid letters to his wife and who would, in time, become the great cautionary tale of the expedition. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the French king, rounded out the company, bringing royal blood, if not royal authority. Here it is worth pausing to look more closely at the world these men came from, because the army marching east was, in miniature, a portrait of medieval European society itself. People of the time liked to imagine their world as divided into three groups: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Those who prayed were the clergy, from the great bishops who lived like princes down to the poor village priests. Those who fought were the nobility, the lords and their knights, who held land in return for military service and who treated war as their birthright and their trade. And those who worked were the vast majority, the peasants, most of them serfs bound to the land they farmed, who fed everyone else and owned almost nothing. A knight was an expensive thing to produce. His warhorse alone could cost as much as a small farm, and he needed several. His armour was a long shirt of mail, thousands of tiny iron rings linked by hand, worn over padded cloth, with a conical helmet and a kite-shaped shield. He fought with lance and sword, and he trained for it from boyhood. All of this was so costly that the knightly class was, by definition, a wealthy one, set far above the foot soldiers who marched beside them. The nobles wore garments of fine wool and linen, dyed in colours that signalled their rank, trimmed sometimes with fur and silk. They ate well by the standards of the age, with meat at most meals, white bread, wine in the south and ale in the north, and spices brought at great expense along the very trade routes that ran through the lands they were about to invade. The common people lived in another world entirely. A peasant's diet was bread, mostly dark and coarse, and pottage, a thick soup of grains and whatever vegetables the season offered, with meat a rare luxury. Their clothes were undyed wool and rough linen, the same garments worn until they fell apart. They lived in 1 or 2 rooms of timber and mud, often sharing the space with their animals in winter for the warmth. Their lives were governed by the seasons, the Lord's demands, and the Church's calendar of feasts and fasts. When such people took the cross, as many thousands did, marching as foot soldiers and servants behind the mounted lords, they were leaving behind the only world they had ever known to walk toward a place they could scarcely picture. For all of them, noble and common alike, Taking the cross was a profound and frightening commitment. This was no weekend campaign. The journey to Jerusalem and back, if one was lucky enough to return, would take years. It meant abandoning home, family, and livelihood, with no certainty of ever seeing them again. It cost a fortune for those who had one, and for those who did not, it meant casting their fate entirely on the road. The vow was a solemn religious act, sworn before God, and breaking it carried the threat of excommunication. Men settled their debts, made peace with old enemies, granted gifts to monasteries to pray for their souls, and put their affairs in order as though preparing to die, because many of them honestly expected to. Through the year 1096, these separate armies took shape across Europe and began to move. They did not travel together, for no single road could feed so many at once, and the leaders had no wish to merge their forces and squabble over command before they had to. Instead, they agreed to meet at the one place that made sense as a gathering point, the great city of Constantinople, the gateway between Europe and Asia. From there, the different routes fanned out. Godfrey of Bouillon led his Lorenas overland down the long Danube road through Hungary, the same path the People's Crusade had taken, though Godfrey kept his men under far tighter discipline. Raymond of Toulouse marched his southern French through the rough country along the Adriatic coast, a miserable journey through hostile, mountainous Dalmatia. The northern French lords crossed into Italy first, intending to sail the short sea crossing from there, and Bohemond, the Norman, gathered his men in southern Italy and shipped them straight across the narrow sea to the Byzantine shore, advancing through the very lands he had once tried to conquer by force. Tens of thousands of fighting men, with countless more servants, clergy, women, and camp followers, were now converging on a single point from three directions, drawn by faith, by ambition, by the hope of land or glory or salvation. To the Emperor Alexios, watching them approach, the sight must have been deeply unsettling. He had asked for help, and an entire armed migration was descending on his capital. The most delicate and dangerous phase of the whole crusade was about to begin, not on a battlefield against the Turks, but in the marble halls and guarded gates of Constantinople, where the suspicious emperor and these proud Western lords would have to find some way to deal with one another. Strangers at Constantinople's gates. The first of the great lords to reach the emperor's city was Hugh of Vermandois, the French king's brother, and his arrival set the tone for everything that followed. Hugh had been shipwrecked crossing the Adriatic and washed up on the Byzantine coast in a sorry state. Alexios received him with great honour, showering him with gifts and fine lodgings, treating him as the distinguished guest his royal blood deserved. He also very politely made it almost impossible for Hugh to leave until certain understandings had been reached. This was the pattern the emperor would use again and again: generosity and courtesy on the surface, and beneath it a firm, unbreakable grip. Alexios had thought hard about how to handle these Westerners, and he had good reason for caution. He remembered Bohemond's father invading his lands not long before. He had just watched the People's Crusade tear through his territory like a plague of locusts. Now several full armies were arriving at his gates, each led by a proud lord with his own ideas, and together they vastly outnumbered the troops Alexios could safely keep in his capital. The emperor wanted their help against the Turks, but he wanted it on his own terms. Above all, he wanted two things from each leader. First, an oath of loyalty, binding them to him as a lord binds his vassals. Second, and more concretely, a solemn promise that any city or territory they captured, which had once belonged to the empire, would be handed back to him. He had no intention of helping these adventurers carve out kingdoms of their own on land he considered Roman. To get these promises, Alexios used every tool he had. He met the leaders with lavish ceremony, seated on his throne in robes stiff with gold, surrounded by the overwhelming wealth and ritual of his court, all of it designed to make a rough Western count feel small. He gave away staggering quantities of gold, silver, fine cloth, and jewels, knowing how short of money many of the crusaders were. And when charm and bribery were not enough, he applied pressure of a simpler kind. He controlled the markets and the supply of food, and he found that a lord who would not swear an oath while well fed often grew more reasonable once the provisions stopped arriving. It is a method of encouraging agreement that is difficult to improve on. The encounter that nearly ended in disaster involved Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey arrived with his army and refused, at first, to swear the personal oath Alexios demanded. He had already pledged loyalty to the German emperor and did not see why he should now bend the knee to a Greek ruler he had only just met. The standoff dragged on through the winter. Godfrey's men, camped outside the walls and growing hungry and restless, began to raid the suburbs. Alexios cut their supplies. The Crusaders attacked. There was real fighting outside Constantinople, Crusader against Byzantine, before either side had so much as seen a Turk. Finally, Alexios brought up his own seasoned troops and gave Godfrey's army a sharp enough check to make the point. Outmatched in the emperor's own back garden, and persuaded that he would get no further without coming to terms, Godfrey swore the oath. Alexios, the gracious victor, immediately loaded him with gifts and good food, and the crisis passed. Then came Bohemond, the old enemy, and he behaved in a way that surprised everyone. The Norman, who had once tried to conquer Byzantine land, arrived all smiles and cooperation. He swore the oath without complaint and urged the others to do the same. Bohemond was no man's fool, and he was playing a longer game. He hoped to win Alexios's trust and perhaps a grand title and command in the emperor's service, a base from which to build his own power in the east. Alexios, who knew exactly what Bohemond was, accepted his oath with equal warmth and equal insincerity. The two of them understood each other perfectly, which is to say, not at all. The hardest case was Raymond of Toulouse, the proud old count who considered himself the senior man of the whole crusade. Raymond flatly refused to swear an oath of vassalage to Alexios, declaring that he had taken the cross for God alone, and would accept no earthly lord but the one he already served. He and the emperor argued at length. In the end, they reached a compromise. Raymond would not swear the full feudal oath, but he gave his word to respect the life and honour of the emperor, and to do nothing to harm his interests. It was less than Alexios wanted, but it would do. The bargaining left Raymond and Bohemond, two of the most powerful leaders, already eyeing each other with deep suspicion, a rivalry that would shadow the crusade for years to come. While the lords haggled, their followers wandered the greatest city in the Christian world with their mouths open. Nothing in Western Europe had prepared them for Constantinople. It held perhaps 500,000 people at a time, when a large western town might hold 10,000. It had paved streets, public squares, aqueducts, vast markets selling goods from across the known world, and churches beyond counting, crowned by the enormous dome of Hagia Sophia, a building so large and so beautiful that visitors struggled to describe it. Above all, the city was crammed with holy relics, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, the bones of saints and apostles, treasures that drew the crusaders like moths. They marvelled, and some of them, being who they were, also calculated how such wealth might be carried off. The Byzantines, for their part, regarded the Westerners with a mixture of fascination and alarm, seeing them as brave but crude, greedy, hot-tempered, and dangerously unpredictable. They lumped them all together under one name, the Franks, regardless of where they actually came from. We know a remarkable amount about how the Byzantines saw these men because of one extraordinary source. The emperor's own daughter, Anna Komnene, grew up to become a scholar and historian, and many years later she wrote a long biography of her father's reign. Her account is one of the most important records we have of the First Crusade from the Greek side, written by a princess who had watched these strange Western lords parade through her father's court when she was a girl. She found them by turns admirable and appalling, and she described their leaders with a sharp, sometimes wickedly observant eye, marvelling especially at Bohemund's commanding presence and at the reckless courage of the Frankish knights, who she thought would charge through the walls of hell itself if you pointed them at it. Once each leader had been brought to terms, Alexios did exactly what he had promised, and rather more efficiently than the Crusaders had any right to expect. He provided them with food, money, and markets. He gave them guides who knew the country and the enemy. He arranged ships to ferry their armies across the Bosphorus to the Asian shore, the same crossing he had used to hustle the People's Crusade out of his city, though this time he was sending real soldiers. And he attached to the expedition a force of his own troops under a trusted general named Tatikios, whose job was both to assist the Crusaders and to take formal possession, in the emperor's name, of any recovered cities. The arrangement looked, on paper, like a sound partnership. The Crusaders would fight, the Byzantines would supply and guide them, and the lost lands would return to the empire while the Westerners marched on to Jerusalem. But the foundation was rotten with mistrust from the start. The Crusaders believed they were doing the empire an enormous favour, and resented being made to swear oaths like servants. They suspected, not without reason, that the slippery Greeks would happily let the Franks bleed for territory that the emperor would then pocket. Alexios, for his part, was certain that these grasping Westerners would seize whatever they could and keep it, oaths or no oaths. Both sides were correct about the other. The alliance held together for now only because both needed it. The Crusaders for supplies and safe passage, the emperor for soldiers willing to die, reclaiming his frontier. By the spring of 1097, the great gathering at Constantinople was complete, and the armies were crossing into Asia. For the first time, the full strength of the proper crusade stood assembled on Turkish soil, tens of thousands of fighting men, no longer the disorganized poor but a true army of the European nobility, supported and guided by the resources of the Byzantine state. Ahead of them lay the Sultanate of Rum, ruled by the same Kilij Arslan who had so easily destroyed the People's Crusade, and who still believed the Franks were nothing to fear. The first test of the real crusade was about to begin, at the strong-walled city that guarded the road into the heart of Anatolia, the Turkish capital of Nicaea, the walls of Nicaea. The first true objective of the crusade was a city with a long memory. Nicaea, which the Turks now held as the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, was an ancient place, ringed by formidable stone walls studded with more than 100 towers, and famous in the Christian world for an event that had happened there more than 7 centuries before. It was at Nicaea, in the year 325, that the first great council of the Church had met and hammered out the statement of belief that millions of Christians still recited. For the Crusaders, then, this was no ordinary target. It was a holy city fallen into enemy hands, and recovering it would feel like the first real proof that God favoured their march. Nicaea was also extremely difficult to attack. Its walls were thick and high, and its western flank rested against the broad waters of a lake, which meant that no besieging army could ever fully surround it. As long as the lake stayed open, supplies and reinforcements could slip in and out by boat, and a city that can be resupplied can hold out almost indefinitely. The Crusaders, arriving in May of 1097, set up their camps before the land walls, with the different lords taking different sections, Godfrey on one side, Bohemund on another, Raymond of Toulouse arriving a little later to close another gate. They settled in to besiege a place that, by the rules of warfare, could not easily be besieged at all. There was one piece of luck. The Sultan, Kilij Arslan, was not in the city. Convinced after his easy slaughter of the People's Crusade that the Franks posed no serious threat, he had marched east to deal with a rival Turkish power, and had left his capital, his treasury, and even his wife and children behind, lightly defended. When word reached him that a vast new army was now besieging Nicaea, he understood his mistake at once and raced back with all the men he could gather. In the middle of May he flung his army against the besiegers, aiming to break the siege and relieve the city. He struck the section held by Raymond of Toulouse's southern French, and there, in a hard day-long fight, the Crusaders held their ground and threw him back with heavy losses. It was the first time the knights of the proper crusade had met the Turks in open battle, and they had won. Kilij Arslan, shocked by the strength and discipline of these new enemies, drew off into the hills. He sent word to the city's defenders that he could not save them, and that they should make whatever terms they could. The defenders fought on regardless, because surrender meant placing themselves at the mercy of an army they had every reason to fear. The fighting around the walls was grim. The Crusaders built siege engines and tried to undermine the towers, and in one ugly practice that the chroniclers record without much comment, they catapulted the severed heads of slain Turks over the walls to frighten those inside. The garrison fought back fiercely, and the lake at their backs kept them fed and supplied no matter what the Crusaders did on land. The siege threatened to drag on for months, and the army outside the walls could not feed itself forever. The solution to the problem of the lake is one of the more memorable feats of the whole campaign. The Crusaders sent a request to the Emperor Alexios, who had set up his own headquarters not far away, keeping a careful watch on the proceedings without committing his main army. Alexios arranged for a fleet of boats to be brought up, but there was no waterway connecting the sea to the inland lake, so the boats were loaded onto wagons and rollers and hauled overland by oxen and men, mile after mile across dry ground, then launched onto the lake on the far side of the city. One morning the defenders of Nicaea looked out across the water that had been their lifeline and saw it covered with imperial warships flying the emperor's banners. The last gap had been closed. The city was now truly surrounded, on land and water both, and its fate was sealed. What happened next left a bitter taste that never quite went away. The Crusaders prepared for a final assault, expecting to storm the city, and by the brutal custom of the age, a city taken by storm could be plundered and its people put to the sword. The common soldiers in particular were counting on the loot to repay their months of hunger and danger, but Alexios had no wish to see his recovered capital sacked, its wealth scattered, and its population butchered, especially when he meant to rule it again himself. So his agents quietly opened secret negotiations with the Turkish garrison, offering them honourable terms of surrender to the emperor rather than to the Franks. The garrison, given a choice between the merciful Greeks and the bloodthirsty Westerners, accepted at once. On the 19th of June, the Crusaders rose for what they expected to be the day of their grand assault, only to find imperial troops already inside the walls and the emperor's banners flying from the towers. Nicaea had surrendered in the night, not to them, but to Alexios. The reaction in the Crusader camp was a sullen fury. They had done the fighting, the dying, and the besieging, and at the last moment the slippery Greeks had snatched away both the glory and the plunder. To make matters worse, Alexios treated the captured garrison and the Sultan's family with great courtesy. Kilij Arslan's wife and children, taken in the city, were sent to Constantinople and eventually released without ransom, a gesture of statesmanship that infuriated crusaders who had been hoping to enrich themselves and avenge their slaughtered comrades from the People's Crusade. To the emperor, it was sound policy, a way of keeping channels open with the Turks and behaving as a civilized ruler should. To the Franks, it looked like proof that the Greeks were untrustworthy schemers more interested in deals than in the holy cause. Alexios understood that he had bruised their pride, and he moved to soothe it in the way he knew best. He distributed gifts and gold among the leaders and the soldiers, enough to take the edge off their anger, and he renewed his promises of support. He did not, however, march on with them. He had recovered his most important lost city without losing a single major battle of his own, using the Crusaders as a battering ram and then stepping in to claim the prize. From his point of view, the arrangement was working beautifully. From the Crusaders' point of view, the seed of a grievance had been planted that would grow, over the coming months, into open resentment, and eventually into a sense that their oaths to such a partner need not bind them forever. Still, whatever the bad feeling, the strategic gain was real and large. The capital of the Sultanate of Rum had fallen, the road into the interior of Anatolia lay open, and the crusade had passed its first great test as a fighting force. The army that set out from Nicaea at the end of June was confident, blooded, and for the moment well supplied. The leaders agreed to divide the host into 2 columns as they advanced, partly so that the land could feed them more easily, since no single region could provide enough food and fodder for the whole mass at once, and partly so they could cover more ground. Bohemond and the Normans, along with Robert of Normandy and others, took the vanguard. Godfrey, Raymond, and the rest followed at some distance behind. It was a reasonable decision, made for sound, practical reasons. It was also exactly the kind of decision that an alert enemy could exploit. Kilij Arslan had been beaten at Nicaea, but he was not finished. Burning with humiliation, he had spent the weeks since making peace with his Turkish rivals and gathering a great army of horse archers, the finest light cavalry in the world, men who could ride and shoot with a speed and precision that no Western knight could match. He had learned, at Nicaea, that these new Franks were not the rabble he had destroyed the year before. Now he meant to catch them strung out and divided on the open road, where his mobile horsemen could swarm a single column before the other could come to its aid. He found his chance only days into the march, on a dusty plain near a place called Dorylaeum, and there the crusade would face the moment that nearly ended it, the Battle of Dorylaeum. On the morning of the 1st of July, 1097, the forward column of the crusade made camp in a broad valley near the ruins of an old town called Dorylaeum. This was the vanguard, led by Bohemond and his Normans, with Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Stephen of Blois, and the Byzantine general Tatikios among them. The larger second column, with Godfrey, Raymond, and Bishop Adhemar, was perhaps a day's march behind. Somewhere back along the dusty road, the 2 halves of the army had drifted farther apart than was wise. Kilij Arslan had been watching and waiting for exactly this. At first light, the Turkish army came down on the camp. It was an enormous force, far larger than the one beaten at Nicaea, for the Sultan had patched up his quarrels with rival Turkish lords, including the powerful Danish Mendemir, and gathered horse archers from across Anatolia. They swept around the Crusader column in a wide, fast-moving ring, and they fought in a way the Westerners had never properly faced before. These were not knights who closed in to trade blows with sword and lance. They were mounted archers, lightly armoured and superbly trained, who galloped close, loosed a storm of arrows, and wheeled away before the heavy Western cavalry could come to grips with them. They filled the air with the thunder of drums and a wailing, shrieking war cry meant to unnerve, and they seemed to be everywhere at once, here, then gone, then back again from another direction. For the Crusader knights it was a nightmare. Their whole way of war depended on the charge, on smashing into an enemy line at full gallop with couched lances and breaking it by sheer weight and shock. But there was no line to break. When they charged, the Turks simply scattered before them and then closed in again behind, peppering them with arrows from every side. A knight could not catch a horse archer, and while he wore himself and his mount out chasing shadows, the arrows kept coming, killing horses, wounding men, and wearing the army down. Many of the Western chroniclers admitted, with grudging respect, that they had never met soldiers like these. Bohemond, whatever his faults, was a superb commander in a crisis, and he grasped at once that to fight the Turks at their own game meant death. He gave the order that saved the day. The knights were not to ride out and chase the enemy. Instead, the whole column was to pull back onto a patch of ground protected by a river and marshy reeds, with water at their backs, so they could not be encircled completely. There the army formed a tight defensive mass. The non-combatants, the women, the clergy, the servants, and the baggage were gathered in the centre for protection. The foot soldiers and archers held the perimeter, and the knights, many of them now dismounted to spare their horses, packed in behind them as a reserve and a hard core. The order was to hold, simply to hold, and to wait. It was a brutal way to spend a summer morning. For hours the Turks circled and shot, and the crusaders stood and took it, unable to strike back effectively, their losses mounting, the heat fierce, their water running short. The women of the camp moved among the fighters, carrying water to the wounded and the exhausted, and the chroniclers, who rarely mention such things, made a point of recording it. More than once the line wavered and nearly broke as the Turks pressed in, scenting victory. Bohemund rode along the perimeter, steadying his men, and he had already done the one other thing that mattered. At the very start of the battle he had sent fast riders galloping back along the road to find the second column and beg them to come with all possible speed. Everything now depended on whether help could arrive before the line gave way. It arrived around midday. The riders had found Godfrey, Raymond and the rest, who flung their men into a punishing forced march under the summer sun, and came up at last on the field. The fresh Crusader knights drove straight into the Turkish horsemen, who had been so absorbed in surrounding the trapped vanguard that they were caught off balance by the new threat. Then Bishop Adhemar, the Pope's own representative and a more than capable soldier, led a detachment on a wide loop around the hills and fell upon the Turks from behind. Suddenly the encirclers were themselves caught between three forces, the stubborn defenders in front, the relief column on the flank, and Adhemar in their rear. The Turkish army, which fought brilliantly when it held the advantage of speed and surprise, had no answer to being pinned and outflanked. The whole host broke and fled, abandoning everything in its haste. The Crusaders surged forward and overran the Sultan's camp, capturing his tents, his treasure, his herds, and great quantities of supplies. Kilij Arslan himself escaped, but his army was scattered and his strategy was in ruins. The losses on both sides had been heavy, and the Crusaders had lost good men and many horses, but they had won a tremendous victory. They had been ambushed at a disadvantage, divided and surrounded, and they had still come through. The battle at Dorylaeum proved that the proper crusade was not the People's Crusade, that these Westerners, properly led, could absorb the worst the Turks could throw at them and prevail. The consequences ran deep. Kilij Arslan, twice beaten now within a few weeks, drew the obvious conclusion. He could not stop this army in the field, so he stopped trying. He gave up the idea of another great battle and adopted a different strategy entirely, one that would prove far more dangerous to the Crusaders than any cavalry charge. He fell back ahead of them, and as he went he laid the land waste, burning crops, poisoning or filling in wells, and driving off livestock, leaving nothing behind that an army could eat or drink. He would let the country itself do his fighting for him. The Crusaders had broken the door into Anatolia, but the long road across its interior would not be contested by soldiers. It would be contested by hunger, thirst, and the merciless summer of the high plateau. The Turkish way of war also taught the Crusaders a lasting lesson. They learned to respect the horse archers and to keep their columns within supporting distance of one another, never again letting half the army wander a full day ahead of the rest. They learned the value of holding formation under fire and of mixing their infantry and crossbowmen with their knights, so that the foot soldiers and archers could keep the enemy at bay, while the heavy cavalry waited for the right moment to charge. These were expensive lessons, paid for in blood, but the army that marched on from Dorylaeum was a wiser and tougher fighting force than the one that had set out from Nicaea. What lay ahead of them, though, no amount of military skill could fully prepare them for. The central plateau of Anatolia in high summer is a hard, dry, scorching country, and Kilij Arslan had stripped it bare. The march that followed Dorylaeum became a grinding ordeal of heat and starvation. Men collapsed on the road. Horses died by the hundreds, so that knights who had ridden proud war horses out of Nicaea were soon trudging on foot, or perched ridiculously on oxen and pack mules, with their armour loaded onto sheep and dogs for want of anything better. Hunting dogs and goats carried the gear of Europe's proudest warriors across the burning plain. The crusade was learning that its deadliest enemy in this campaign would not always carry a bow, and so the army pressed on into the wasted interior, victorious but suffering, drawing ever deeper into a hostile land, toward the mountains beyond and the great prize that waited past them. But before they reached the walls of Antioch, the host would change shape again. ambition and opportunity would pull part of it away to the east, where one of the leaders would seize a chance to win himself a city and a title of his own, and in doing so would create the first of the crusader states, far from Jerusalem, on the banks of a distant river. That ambitious man was Baldwin, the younger brother of Godfrey, and his road led to the Armenian city of Edessa, across the burning heart of Anatolia. The march that followed the victory at Dorylaeum tested the Crusaders in ways no battle could. For weeks they pushed across the central plateau of Anatolia, a high, dry country that Kilij Arslan had deliberately stripped of everything useful. The summer sun was merciless, the wells were ruined, and the food the army carried ran low. Men died of thirst on the road, their tongues swollen, falling out of the column to be left where they lay. The animals suffered worst of all. War horses, the pride and the weapon of the knightly class, dropped dead by the hundreds, until great lords found themselves walking like common soldiers or riding oxen, with their armour and gear lashed onto whatever beast survived, including goats, sheep, and pack dogs. It was a strange and humbling procession, the flower of European chivalry creeping across a wasteland on the backs of farm animals. Eventually the army reached gentler country, passing the city of Iconium, which the Turks had abandoned, and finding orchards, streams, and grazing again. The worst of the thirst was behind them, but a new ordeal lay ahead in the mountains. To reach Syria and the road to Antioch, the Crusaders had to cross the Anti-Taurus range, and the passage through those mountains was one of the most miserable episodes of the entire campaign. The tracks were narrow, steep, and slick with mud and rain, clinging to the sides of deep ravines. Pack animals lost their footing and tumbled into the gorges, dragging their loads with them, and sometimes a roped line of beasts pulled one another over the edge. Knights, despairing, tried to sell their weapons and armour for a pittance or simply threw them away rather than carry them another step. The chroniclers, who were rarely given to complaint, described this stretch as a place of real horror. Beyond the mountains the land changed again, and so did the people in it. The Crusaders came down into Cilicia and the borders of Syria, regions with large populations of Armenian and Syrian Christians who had lived for generations under Turkish rule. These Eastern Christians, who belonged to different churches than the Latins of the West and worshipped in different ways, nonetheless welcomed the Crusaders as fellow believers and as potential liberators from their Muslim overlords. After months of marching through hostile, emptied country, the army found friendly faces, open markets, and local guides who knew the land. For the leaders, it also opened a new kind of opportunity. Here were Christian towns and cities ripe to be taken from the Turks, and ambitious men began to think less about the distant goal of Jerusalem and more about what they might seize for themselves along the way. Two of those ambitious men were Tancred, the nephew of Bohemond, and Baldwin, the younger brother of Godfrey of Bouillon. Each led a detachment off from the main army into the towns of Cilicia, capturing places like Tarsus, Adana, and Mamistra in the name of the Crusade, and increasingly in their own names. The two of them very nearly came to blows over who would hold Tarsus, their men actually skirmishing over the spoils, an early and ugly sign that the unity of the Crusade was beginning to fray now that real prizes were within reach. Tancred eventually rejoined the main host, but Baldwin had bigger ideas and circumstances had freed him to pursue them. He was a landless younger son with little to inherit, and his wife had recently died on the march, so he had neither estate nor family pulling him back toward home. He was, in short, a man with everything to gain and almost nothing to lose, which made him exactly the sort of man to gamble on a bold move. That move took him east, away from the main army, with only a small band of knights, toward the Euphrates River and the rich and ancient city of Edessa. This was deep in Armenian Christian territory, a long way from the Crusade's line of march and well beyond anything the Emperor Alexios could plausibly claim. Edessa was a place with a remarkable history. By its own proud tradition, it had been one of the very first cities anywhere to embrace Christianity, and it treasured a legend that its ancient king had exchanged letters with Jesus himself and received a miraculous portrait of his face, relics that pilgrims still came to venerate. It was wealthy, well fortified, and strategically vital, sitting astride the approaches between Anatolia and the rest of the Muslim world. Edessa was ruled at this time by an Armenian Christian governor named Thoros, an unpopular man hemmed in by hostile Turkish neighbours and desperate for a strong protector. When Baldwin arrived with his hardened Western knights, Thoros saw exactly the ally he needed. He welcomed Baldwin into the city, showered him with gifts, and, having no son of his own, took the extraordinary step of formally adopting the Western lord as his heir. The ceremony was a strange one. By the local custom, Baldwin and the elderly Thoros were made to stand together inside a single, enormous shirt, pressed chest to chest as father and son, sealing the bond. Whatever Baldwin thought of this peculiar arrangement, he understood its value at once. He was now the designated successor to the lordship of Edessa. He did not have to wait long, and the speed with which fortune favoured him raised eyebrows even at the time. Within weeks of Baldwin's arrival, the people of Edessa, who already hated Thoros, rose up against their ruler in a sudden and violent revolt. Thoros was overthrown and killed, and Baldwin, the newly adopted heir and the man with the only effective fighting force in the city, stepped smoothly into the vacant lordship. How much Baldwin knew of the uprising in advance, or how much he encouraged it, the sources do not say, and he was not the kind of man to leave a written confession. What is certain is that by the early spring of 1098, Baldwin of Boulogne, who had crossed into Asia with no land of his own, ruled the great city of Edessa and the territory around it. This was a development of real importance, and not only for Baldwin's personal fortunes. The county of Edessa, as it came to be called, was the very first of the Crusader states, established more than a year before the crusade reached its supposed goal, and it was founded squarely against the spirit of the oaths the leaders had sworn at Constantinople. Edessa was a city Baldwin had taken for himself and meant to keep for himself, with no intention of handing it over to the emperor. It set a pattern. The idea that a crusading lord might carve out his own lasting domain in the east, rather than simply liberate territory and pass it on, had now been put into practice. Bohemond, watching from afar, surely took note, for he had ambitions of exactly the same kind, fixed on a far greater prize that the main army was even now approaching. For the crusade as a whole, Baldwin's coup proved a genuine asset, whatever the leaders thought of his methods. Edessa was rich, and Baldwin, secure in his new domain, was able to send money, food and supplies westward to the main army, at a moment when it would need such help desperately. His city also guarded the eastern flank of the crusade, blocking the approach by which Muslim forces from Mesopotamia might have struck the main host in the rear. By accident or design, the First Crusader state strengthened the position of the whole expedition, but Edessa was a sideshow, however profitable, to the main drama. The bulk of the crusade had pressed on through Syria, drawing closer to the obstacle that everyone knew would be the hardest test yet. Ahead of them lay Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the ancient and medieval world, a place of immense size, immense walls, and immense importance, both military and spiritual. It was the gateway to Syria, and the last great stronghold barring the road to Jerusalem. Taking it would not be a matter of weeks. The Crusaders were about to begin a siege that would consume them for the better part of a year, a siege so long, so cruel, and so nearly fatal that it would push the whole enterprise to the edge of collapse. The ordeal of Antioch was about to begin. The Siege of Antioch. The Crusaders reached the walls of Antioch in October of 1097, and the sight of the place must have sobered even the most confident among them. Antioch was one of the oldest and greatest cities of the eastern Mediterranean, a centre of trade and learning since ancient times, and one of the cradles of the Christian faith itself. Its defences were on a scale the Westerners had never encountered. The walls ran for miles, studded with more than 400 towers, climbing from the river up the steep flanks of a mountain called Silpius, with a fortress perched high on the summit. To storm such a place by direct assault was out of the question. The Crusaders would have to starve it out, and to do that they had to surround it, and the bitter truth was that their army, large as it was, could not stretch far enough to seal off the entire enormous perimeter. The Turkish governor, a hardened commander named Yagisian, knew this perfectly well, and he settled in to wait, confident that he could keep at least some supply routes open through the gates that faced the mountains. So began one of the longest and most agonizing sieges of the Middle Ages, and the besiegers would suffer at least as much as the besieged. In the first weeks things went well enough. It was autumn, the surrounding orchards and farms were heavy with fruit and grain, and the Crusaders, with the recklessness of men who had recently been starving, gorged themselves and wasted their supplies, slaughtering animals and feasting as though the abundance would never end. It did end, and quickly. By the time winter set in, the army had eaten through the local countryside, and what they had not consumed they had ruined or failed to store. Then came the cold. The winter of 1097 into 1098 was savage. Freezing rain and wind tore through the Crusader camp. The river flooded, and the men shivered in sodden tents with nothing to eat. Famine took hold and tightened its grip month after month. The chroniclers record that people ate their war horses, then their pack animals, then dogs, rats, and the leather of their own gear, then roots and thistles dug from the frozen ground. The price of any scrap of food climbed beyond reach. Disease spread through the weakened, filthy camp, and men died, not by the dozen but by the hundreds. The proud cavalry of the Crusade nearly ceased to exist, the number of fit war horses falling from many thousands to a pitiful few hundred, so that knights who could no longer mount fought on foot or not at all. Under such misery, the will of many simply broke. Desertion became a serious problem. Soldiers slipped away in the night to try to make their way home, and even some prominent figures lost their nerve. Peter the Hermit, the very man who had set the first wave of Crusaders marching, tried to flee the camp and was caught and brought back in disgrace, a sad end to the career of the preacher who had once moved thousands with a word. Most damaging of all was the departure of Tatikios, the Byzantine general the emperor had sent to assist the army and to claim recovered cities in his name. Early in the new year, Tatikios left the camp, announcing that he was going to arrange for supplies and reinforcements. He never came back. Whatever his real reasons, the Crusaders chose to see his departure as proof that the Greeks had abandoned them in their hour of need, and Bohemond in particular filed the grievance away carefully, for it would be very useful to him later when he argued that the oaths sworn to Alexios no longer counted. The besieged, meanwhile, were far from passive. Yagisian sent urgent appeals to the great Muslim powers of Syria for relief, and he made life inside the city hard for its considerable Christian population, whom he no longer trusted, expelling some and imprisoning others. Twice during the long siege, large Muslim armies marched to break it. The first, sent from Damascus, was intercepted by a Crusader foraging force at the end of 1097 and turned back after a hard fight. The second and more serious threat came in February of 1098, when the ruler of nearby Aleppo advanced with a substantial army to relieve the city. Bohemond, taking command, met it on a narrow strip of ground between a lake and the river, where the enemy's greater numbers could not be brought to bear all at once. Conserving his few precious horses, he handled the battle with great skill and shattered the relief force, sending it fleeing back to Aleppo. These victories kept the siege alive, but they did not end it, and they did nothing to fill the empty bellies in the Crusader camp. Relief for the besiegers came not by land, but by sea. The Crusaders held the nearby port of St. Simeon, and through it began to arrive the help that kept them in the fight. Ships from the Italian city of Genoa and a fleet from England put in at the harbour, carrying food, building materials, craftsmen and tools. With these resources, the Crusaders at last began to tighten their grip on the city in earnest. They built fortified positions to block the gates that had remained open, raising siege castles opposite the bridge and the mountain approaches, and slowly choked off the routes by which Yagician had been feeding his garrison. The road between the port and the camp was dangerous, swept by sorties from the city, and many died keeping it open. But the supplies got through, and as spring of 1098 came on, the balance began, very slowly, to shift. Yet even as the Crusaders finally closed their ring around Antioch, far more terrible news was making its way toward them. The greatest Muslim power in the region, the ruler of Mosul in distant Mesopotamia, a formidable warlord named Kerbaga, had been persuaded that the Frankish invasion was a threat too dangerous to ignore. He was gathering an army far larger than anything the Crusaders had yet faced, drawing contingents from across the Muslim East, and he was marching to crush them and relieve Antioch. If Kerbaga reached the city while the Crusaders still sat outside its walls, they would be caught between the great fortress in front of them and an overwhelming army at their backs, pinned in the open and destroyed. The siege had become a race. The Crusaders had to take Antioch, somehow, before Kerbaga arrived, and after more than 7 months before its walls they were no closer to breaking in by force than they had been in October. It was at this desperate moment that Bohemond revealed the scheme he had been quietly preparing. The walls of Antioch could not be stormed, but walls are only as loyal as the men who guard them. Bohemond had opened a secret correspondence with one of the captains of the garrison, a man in command of a section of the towers, who for reasons of his own, fear, greed, a personal grudge against Yagician, or some mixture of all three, was willing to betray the city. The Norman lord went to the other leaders with a proposal wrapped in a condition. He would get them inside Antioch, he said, but only if they agreed that the city would be his to keep afterward. The other princes, exhausted, frightened of Kerbogha's approach, and unable to think of any better plan, reluctantly agreed, with the proud Raymond of Toulouse the most resentful of all, for he saw exactly what Bohemond was doing and could do nothing to stop it. The bargain struck. The trap was laid. On a chosen night in early June of 1098, with Kerbaga's vast army now only days away, Bohemond's secret ally inside the city prepared to open his towers to the Crusaders. After 8 months of cold, hunger, death, and despair before walls they could not breach, the men of the First Crusade were about to get into Antioch at last. What they did not yet know was that taking the city would not save them. It would only change the nature of their peril, trapping the besiegers inside the very prize they had bled so long to win, with the largest enemy army of the entire campaign closing in around them. The hardest days of the whole crusade still lay ahead. A city won, a city lost. The plan turned on a single man inside the walls. Bohemond's secret contact was a captain named Firouz, who commanded a stretch of towers on the southern side of Antioch. His exact motives are lost to us, though the chroniclers suggested a grievance against the governor and a healthy interest in reward, and on the night chosen for the betrayal, he was as good as his word. In the darkness of early June 1098, a small party of crusaders crept up to the base of his tower, and a ladder was let down or raised against the wall. The first men climbed in near silence, secured the neighbouring towers, killed the guards, and threw open a gate. Bohemond's banner was raised on the heights as the signal, and the crusaders who had been waiting in the dark poured into the city they had besieged for 8 long months. What followed was the brutal reality of a city taken by storm. As dawn broke, the crusaders surged through the streets of Antioch, and in the confusion and bloodlust of the breakthrough they killed without much distinction between soldier and civilian, Muslim and, in the chaos, even some of the local Christians. The governor Yagician, who had defended the place so stubbornly, fled the city in the panic and was caught and killed by local people in the hills outside, his head carried back as a trophy. By the end of the day, the Crusaders held Antioch, but they did not hold all of it. High above the city on the peak of the mountain stood the citadel, a strong fortress in its own right, and into it had withdrawn a Turkish garrison under the dead governor's son. They slammed its gates and held firm. The Crusaders had taken the great city at last, after all their suffering, and yet an enemy still looked down on them from the rock above, waiting. They had no time to deal with it, because the race they had been running was already lost. Bohemond's treachery had won them the city by the narrowest of margins. Only 2 or 3 days after they broke in, the dust of an enormous army appeared on the horizon, and Kerboga of Mosul arrived with the largest host the Crusade had yet faced. In a single stroke the whole situation turned upside down. The besiegers were now the besieged. The Crusaders were shut inside Antioch, with Kerboga's vast army surrounding the walls and the Turkish garrison still holding the citadel above their heads, able to sally down into the city at any moment. They had traded one trap for another, and the new one looked far deadlier than the old. It is worth noting just how narrowly they had escaped total disaster, and why. Kerboga could have reached Antioch before it fell, and had he done so, he would have caught the Crusaders in the open and destroyed them. But on his march, he had stopped to besiege Edessa, Baldwin's new city, gambling that he could snuff out that Crusader outpost first and secure his rear. Edessa held against him for 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks were precisely the time the Crusaders needed to bribe their way into Antioch. Baldwin's controversial little adventure on the Euphrates, which the other leaders had grumbled about, had unwittingly bought the entire crusade its survival. Survival, though, was still very much in doubt. The Crusaders had taken a city that had nothing left to eat. The long siege had already stripped Antioch and its surroundings bare, and now the Crusaders inside found themselves starving all over again. Worse than before, with no port to bring relief and no countryside to forage, hemmed in on every side. Famine returned with full force. Men ate whatever they could find, and morale, already battered by months of misery, began to crumble entirely. Each night, soldiers lowered themselves over the walls on ropes and slipped away into the dark to escape, so common a sight that the chroniclers gave these deserters a mocking name, the rope dancers. The army that had conquered Antioch was visibly coming apart inside it. The most consequential desertion had happened just before the city fell, and it would have effects far beyond one man's reputation. Stephen of Blois, the wealthy and cultured count who had written such cheerful letters home to his wife, had fallen ill, or claimed to, and had left the camp shortly before Bohemond's coup. From a safe distance he watched Kerboga's gathering host, concluded that the crusade was doomed, and decided to go home. As he made his way north he encountered the Emperor Alexios, who was at that very moment marching south with an army to support the Crusaders, exactly the reinforcement they were praying for. Stephen told the emperor that the situation at Antioch was hopeless, that the Crusaders were surely already destroyed or about to be, and that there was nothing to be gained by going on. Alexios, a cautious man who had no wish to march his army straight into a catastrophe and lose it for nothing, believed him. He turned around and went back. For the Crusaders, when they later learned of it, this was the ultimate betrayal, and it finished whatever trust remained between them and Byzantium. The emperor had been coming to help, and at the decisive moment he had turned away and abandoned them to their fate. Bohemond, who wanted Antioch for himself and needed a reason to renounce the oath that promised it to Alexios, could not have asked for a better gift. The emperor's failure to appear became, in Crusader eyes, a desertion that voided every promise they had made at Constantinople. As for Stephen of Blois, he carried the brand of a coward home with him, and the shame of it would later drive him back east on another expedition, where he would die, his honour restored at the cost of his life. Inside Antioch, through the middle of June, the Crusaders endured a misery that pushed them to the edge of total collapse. Kerboga pressed his attacks against the walls and around the citadel, and the half-starved defenders threw him back again and again, but at terrible cost and with dwindling strength. There was savage fighting on the slopes below the citadel, where the garrison above and Kerboga's men tried to link up and split the city in two, and the Crusaders, fighting uphill on empty stomachs, just barely held the line. The leaders met in grim councils, and even the boldest of them were running out of ideas. They were trapped, outnumbered, starving, and surrounded, with no relief coming and no obvious way out. Many believed the end was simply a matter of time. In such moments, when ordinary hope has run out, people turn to other kinds. And it was now, at the lowest point of the entire crusade, that a strange and powerful thing happened in Antioch, something that would either be remembered as a miracle or dismissed as a desperate trick, depending on who told the story. A poor and otherwise unremarkable pilgrim, a man named Peter Bartholomew, came forward claiming that he had been visited in a series of visions by St. Andrew, and that the saint had revealed to him a secret hidden beneath the floor of one of the city's churches. Buried there, Peter said, lay one of the holiest relics in all of Christianity, the very lance that a Roman soldier had thrust into the side of Christ as he hung on the cross. If the crusaders found it, the saint had promised, it would be the sign that God had not abandoned them, and with it they would triumph. In a starving, terrified army with nothing left to lose, such a promise was not a small thing. It was a spark thrown into dry tinder, and what it set alight would carry the crusade out of the trap of Antioch and back onto the road to Jerusalem. The Holy Lance, the man at the centre of it all, Peter Bartholomew, was not the sort anyone would have chosen as a vessel for divine revelation. He was a poor pilgrim of low birth and, by some accounts, a rather disreputable character, not a priest or a holy man, but an ordinary follower of the army. Yet he came before the leaders with a detailed and insistent story. Over several nights, he said, St. Andrew had appeared to him and rebuked the crusaders for their sins, but had also promised them deliverance. The proof would be the Holy Lance, the spearhead that had pierced the side of Christ, which the saint declared lay buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter, inside Antioch itself. Find it, and victory would follow. The leaders were divided over whether to believe him. Raymond of Toulouse, the proud old count, embraced the vision wholeheartedly, and his chaplain became its most devoted recorder and promoter. The relic would, conveniently, be associated with Raymond's faction, lending him spiritual prestige at a moment when Bohemond was gaining the upper hand in worldly matters. The Pope's representative, Bishop Adhemar, was far more sceptical. He was an educated and sensible man, and he had reason to doubt, for he had seen a relic claimed to be the very same Holy Lance displayed back in Constantinople, which made a second one buried in Antioch rather hard to credit. But Adhemar was wise enough to read the mood of a desperate, starving army, and he did not openly denounce the vision. The hope it offered was too valuable to crush, so they dug. On a day in the middle of June 1098, a party of men laboured in the floor of the cathedral, watched by an anxious crowd, turning over the earth hour after hour and finding nothing. As the day wore on, and the pit yielded only soil and rubble, the doubters grew louder. Then Peter Bartholomew himself climbed down into the hole, scrabbled in the dirt, and rose holding a piece of iron, which he proclaimed to be the head of the Holy Lance. To the believers, it was a miracle, undeniable proof of God's favour. To the skeptics, it looked very much as though a man who knew exactly where to dig had produced an object he could easily have placed there himself. But in that moment, inside the trap of Antioch, with Kerberger's army outside and starvation within, the skeptics kept their suspicions quiet, because the effect on the army was immediate and overwhelming. A despairing host that had been melting away by the night was suddenly transformed into a body of fervent believers convinced that God was about to fight on their side. Other visions quickly followed, as they tend to in such times. A priest reported that Christ himself had appeared to him with promises of aid. There was talk that the spirits of crusaders who had died on the long march would rise and return to fight alongside the living, led by the warrior saints of the Eastern Church, St. George, St. Demetrius, and St. Mercurius, mounted on white horses and clad in shining arms. The whole emotional temperature of the army swung from black despair to burning confidence, and the leaders, recognizing that they could not hold out much longer in any case, made the bold decision that this new mood made possible. Rather than wait passively to starve, they would march out of Antioch and offer open battle to Kerboga's far larger army, trusting in their renewed faith and in the disorder they hoped to find among their enemies. Before the battle, they did what their faith demanded. They fasted, which was not difficult under the circumstances, confessed their sins, and walked in solemn religious procession through the city. They also tried diplomacy of a sort. Peter the Hermit, his earlier disgrace apparently forgiven or at least set aside, was sent out as an envoy to Kerboga to propose terms, perhaps even to suggest settling the matter by a contest of champions. Kerboga, supremely confident in his numbers, dismissed the offer with contempt and sent the envoy back empty-handed. He had the crusaders trapped and starving, and he saw no reason to bargain with men he expected to crush at his leisure. But Kerboga's position was not nearly as strong as it looked, and his greatest weakness was the army itself. His host was a coalition made up of contingents from many different Muslim rulers across Syria and Mesopotamia, lords who distrusted one another and distrusted Kerboga even more. Several of them had no wish to see the powerful ruler of Mosul grow stronger still by destroying the Franks and dominating the whole region. They had come because they had to, and they were watching for an excuse to leave. Kerboga, for his part, had failed to win their loyalty, and his overconfidence made matters worse. The Crusaders were counting, whether they knew the details or not, on exactly this fragility. On the morning of the 28th of June, 1098, the gates of Antioch opened, and the Crusader army marched out to give battle. They came out in organised divisions, one after another crossing the bridge over the river, with the various lords each leading a battalion, the priests in their vestments praying over them, and the holy lance carried aloft in their midst as a banner of God's favour. Most of them were on foot, for the horses were nearly all gone, and they were thin and weak from hunger. By any sober calculation they should have been destroyed. Kerboga made his first mistake here. He could have attacked the Crusaders as they crossed the bridge, striking each division before the next could form up, but instead, perhaps wanting to lure them all out and annihilate the entire army at once, he let them deploy unmolested onto the plain. Once the Crusaders had formed their line, the battle unfolded with surprising speed. The Crusaders advanced steadily, and Kerboga's attempts to encircle them were met and held. Then the thing the Crusaders had hoped for came to pass. As the fighting developed, large contingents of Kerboga's allies simply withdrew from the field, the resentful emirs choosing this moment to abandon him rather than risk their men for his glory. Whether from this defection, the unexpected steadiness of the starving Franks, fires set in the dry grass, or the visions of warrior saints that the Crusaders swore they saw riding to their aid, Kerboga's great army lost its cohesion and then its nerve. The withdrawal of his allies became a general flight. The mighty host that had trapped the crusade broke and ran, abandoning its camp, its supplies, and its treasure. And the half-starved crusaders, scarcely able to believe it, found themselves masters of the field. The victory was total and, by every reasonable expectation, impossible. The relief of Antioch was complete. The Turkish garrison still holding the citadel above the city, watching Kerboga's army scatter across the plain, recognized that no help was coming and surrendered. There was an immediate and telling quarrel over to whom they should surrender, Bohemond or Raymond, and it was Bohemond's banner that was raised over the citadel, a clear signal of who now truly held the city. The Crusaders had been delivered from certain destruction, and many of them never doubted that the Holy Lance had done it. That relic, though, would not keep its glory for long. In the months to come, doubts about its authenticity would grow. The rivalry between Raymond's faction and the skeptics would sharpen, and Peter Bartholomew would eventually be pressed to prove his honesty in the most drastic way imaginable, by walking through fire. But all of that lay ahead. For now, the crusade had survived its darkest hour and won its most astonishing victory. The road to Jerusalem was open once more, And yet, having escaped the trap together, the leaders of the crusade promptly did what victorious allies so often do. They began to fight among themselves over the spoils, and the great prize of Antioch became the bone of a quarrel that would stall the march to the holy city for months. Quarrels among the victors. Having survived the unsurvivable, the Crusaders did not immediately press on toward Jerusalem, and the reasons for the delay reveal how far the holy enterprise had become tangled in very worldly ambitions. It was high summer, the season was brutally hot for marching, and the army was exhausted and depleted. But the deeper cause of the long pause was a bitter dispute over a single question: who would rule Antioch? Bohemon's claim was simple and self-serving. He had engineered the capture of the city through his secret arrangement with Firuz. The other leaders had agreed beforehand that it would be his if he got them inside, and the Emperor Alexios, who had been promised the city under the oaths sworn at Constantinople, had abandoned them at Antioch when he turned back on the road. Therefore, Bohemond argued, the oath was void and the city was rightfully his. Against him stood Raymond of Toulouse, the proudest defender of the agreements with Byzantium, who insisted that the oath still bound them all, and that Antioch must be held for the emperor, or at the very least, not simply pocketed by the grasping Norman. Raymond's motives were not purely high-minded, for he held a few key positions within the city himself and had no desire to see his great rival become a sovereign prince. So the two camps glared at each other across a divided Antioch, Bohemond holding the citadel and most of the city, Raymond clinging to the palace and the bridge, and the march to Jerusalem ground to a halt over the matter. The Crusaders sent word to Alexios, inviting him to come and take possession of the city in person, and thereby settle the argument. But the emperor, ever cautious and now thoroughly distrusted by the Westerners, did not come. His delay, whatever its reasons, played directly into Bohemond's hands. For every month that passed without the emperor appearing made it easier to argue that Byzantium had forfeited its claim. The leaders also wrote to Pope Urban, the man who had started it all, reporting their astonishing victory, begging him to come east himself to lead them on to Jerusalem, and asking him to resolve the question of the church in their newly conquered lands. Urban never came, and in one of the sadder ironies of the whole story, he would die in 1099 without ever learning that the crusade he had launched had succeeded. The news of Jerusalem's fall reaching Rome just after his death, the crusade had also lost the one man who might have held it together through these quarrels. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the Pope's representative, the wise and respected mediator who had calmed disputes, steadied morale, and given the expedition a unifying voice, died on the 1st of August, 1098, carried off by an epidemic that swept through the Crusader ranks in the unhealthy aftermath of the siege. His loss was incalculable. He had been the closest thing the crusade had to a neutral leader whom all the proud lords would heed, and without him, the rivalries ran unchecked. The disease that killed him, probably typhoid bred in the filth and crowding of the long campaign, killed thousands of others as well, and for a time it scattered the army, the leaders withdrawing to different towns to escape the sickness and to keep their men fed. That scattering became, predictably, another round of land grabbing. Rather than concentrate on Jerusalem, the leaders spent the autumn and early winter of 1098 capturing and garrisoning towns in the region around Antioch, extending their holdings, installing their own men, and in Raymond's case even setting up a Latin bishop in a captured town to strengthen his position. Each lord was quietly building a base of power in Syria, hedging against the possibility that the real rewards of the crusade lay not in distant Jerusalem, but right here, in the rich lands they had already conquered. The holy goal that had drawn them from Europe seemed in danger of being forgotten amid the practical business of carving up Syria. It was the ordinary crusaders who saved the expedition from dissolving into a squabble of petty lordships. The common soldiers and the poor pilgrims who made up the bulk of the host had not crossed a continent, buried their friends in the desert, and starved through the Siege of Antioch in order to watch their leaders haggle over Syrian towns. They had come for Jerusalem, and their patience was running out. Through the autumn and winter, their anger grew louder and more dangerous. They began to threaten that if the lords would not lead them onward, they would choose a leader of their own and march without them. In some accounts, they swore to tear down the very walls of the disputed towns, even of Antioch itself, reasoning that if there were no fortress left to fight over, the leaders would have nothing to quarrel about and no excuse to stay. It was the pressure from below, far more than any agreement among the princes, that finally got the crusade moving again. Faced with this mounting fury, and seeing a chance to reclaim the moral leadership of the expedition that Bohemond's worldly success had stolen from him, Raymond of Toulouse changed course. If he could not have Antioch, he could at least be the man who led the faithful to the holy city, and that prestige might prove worth more than any single town. Early in 1099 he made the decisive move. He took up the role of leader of the march, gathered those who would follow, and set out south toward Jerusalem at last. To shame the others into joining, he is said to have walked at the head of the column as a humble pilgrim. The strategy worked. Godfrey, the two Roberts, Tancred, and the rest, unwilling to be left behind and to surrender the glory of the final triumph to Raymond alone, fell in and marched south too. One man did not. Bohemond stayed behind. He had what he had come for, a great city and the makings of a principality of his own, and he had no intention of risking it by marching off to Jerusalem. The most brilliant soldier of the crusade, the man whose cunning had taken Antioch and whose generalship had broken Kerberga, dropped out of the holy war at the threshold of its goal to become the ruler of Antioch, founder of the Second Crusader state. His ambition had been satisfied. The pilgrimage could continue without him. And so, after a delay of many months that had nearly torn the crusade apart, the army turned its face toward Jerusalem once more, reduced in number, stripped of some of its ablest leaders, but still formidable and now driven by a determination sharpened by all it had endured. Ahead lay the long march down through Syria and into the lands of Palestine, a journey that would have to be managed with unexpected care. For the political landscape to the south was different from anything they had yet faced. The road to the holy city would test not only their swords but their judgment, and it would pass through one more bitter ordeal, in which the holy lance that had saved them at Antioch would be put to a terrible and very public test. The long road south, the march that resumed in the early months of 1099, moved through a political landscape quite different from the one the Crusaders had fought their way across in the north. The Turks, who had ruled Syria and Anatolia, were Sunni Muslims, loosely tied to the Seljuk world, and they had been the Crusaders' enemies at Nicaea, Dorylaeum, and Antioch. But the southern lands toward which the army now marched, including the coastal cities of Lebanon and Palestine, and the prize of Jerusalem itself, had recently fallen under the control of a rival Muslim power, the Fatimid Caliphate based in Egypt. The Fatimids were Shia, and they regarded the Sunni Turks as enemies every bit as bitter as the Christians did. In fact, while the Crusaders had been bogged down at Antioch, the Fatimids had taken Jerusalem from the Turks. The Muslim world the Crusaders were entering was deeply divided against itself, and that division would help the Christians as much as any victory of their own. The Fatimids, sensibly enough, had no wish to fight the formidable Franks if they could avoid it, and they had been trying for months to reach an understanding. They had sent envoys to the Crusaders during the Siege of Antioch, proposing a kind of alliance against the common Turkish enemy and offering the Christians free and protected access to Jerusalem as pilgrims, provided they came peacefully and in small numbers. It was a reasonable offer, and from the Fatimid point of view a generous one, but it fundamentally misread what the Crusaders wanted. They had not crossed the world to visit Jerusalem as tourists under Muslim protection. They had come to take it and to hold it, and no offer of pilgrim access could satisfy that ambition. The negotiations went nowhere, and the Crusaders marched on toward a city the Fatimids now had to defend. Before they reached it, there was one more costly delay, and it brought the strange affair of the Holy Lance to its grim conclusion. Raymond of Toulouse, still hungry for a domain of his own, laid siege to a town called Arca, near the wealthy coastal city of Tripoli, hoping to win himself a base of power in the region. The siege dragged on for weeks and then months, achieving nothing, and the ordinary crusaders, who had heard all this before, grew furious at yet another self-serving hold-up. It was during this stalled siege that the long-simmering doubts about Peter Bartholomew and his relic finally boiled over. The skeptics, whose suspicions had only grown since Adamar's death, openly accused Peter of fraud. To defend the lance and his own honour and the prestige it lent to Raymond's faction, Peter Bartholomew agreed to prove the truth of his visions by the ancient test of the ordeal. He would walk through fire, trusting God to carry him through unharmed. In the spring of 1099, before a great crowd, 2 long heaps of dry branches were set alight with a narrow path left between them, and Peter Bartholomew, carrying the Holy Lance, walked into the flames. He emerged from the far side, but terribly burned, and whether the fire alone did it or the frenzied crowd that pressed in around him made his injuries worse, he died of his wounds a few days later. His death settled nothing cleanly, for his defenders insisted he had passed the test and been hurt only afterward, while his accusers took his death as plain proof of fraud. But the spell was broken. The Holy Lance, which had lifted a doomed army at Antioch, lost much of its power over men's minds, and with it Raymond lost a measure of the spiritual authority he had built upon it. Under all this pressure, Raymond at last abandoned the pointless siege of Arca, and the army turned south once more, this time without distraction. From here the Crusaders showed that they had learned something about how to move an army through enemy country. Rather than besiege every town along the coast, which would have taken years they did not have, they marched swiftly down the coastal road, and the local Muslim rulers, eager to be rid of these dangerous strangers, were happy to help them on their way. The cities of the Lebanese and Palestinian coast, places like Tripoli, Beirut, Sidon, and Acre, sent the Crusaders food, money, horses, and guides, and bought their safe passage with tribute and gifts. Both sides understood the arrangement perfectly. The Crusaders wanted Jerusalem, not these coastal towns, and the towns wanted the Crusaders gone, not destroyed. So the army that had once crawled across Anatolia dying of thirst now swept down the coast well supplied and unopposed, covering in weeks a distance that the fighting in the north had taken months. As they neared their goal, the Crusaders turned inland from the coast, leaving the easy road for the rougher hill country that led up to Jerusalem. The Fatimid governor of the city, a capable commander, had been preparing for them. He strengthened the walls, laid in supplies, brought in a strong garrison, and, knowing that the summer would be the Crusaders' enemy, he set about destroying or poisoning the wells and cisterns in the countryside around the city, so that any besieging army would find itself parched in the dry heat. He also, as a precaution, expelled or restricted the local Christian population, fearing they might aid the attackers from within. Jerusalem would not fall easily, and then, after everything, the Crusaders saw it. On a day in early June, 1099, the army crested the last ridge on the road from the coast, and there before them, after 3 years of marching, fighting, starving, and dying, after some 2,000 miles of road that had begun in the fields of France, lay the city of Jerusalem. The reaction, recorded by those who were there, was overwhelming. Hardened soldiers wept openly. Men fell to their knees and pressed their faces to the ground. Many took off their shoes to walk the last stretch barefoot, as humble pilgrims approaching a holy place. The hill from which they first glimpsed the city was given a name that meant the Mount of Joy, and the joy was real, the kind that comes only after long suffering, when a thing endlessly hoped for and half despaired of finally stands plainly in view. But the host that gazed down on Jerusalem that day was a shadow of the great movement that had set out from Europe, of the tens of thousands who had taken the cross, who had marched through Hungary, gathered at Constantinople, and crossed into Asia. Only a fraction now remained. Disease, battle, hunger, desertion, and the long detours of ambition had thinned the ranks until perhaps no more than 12 or 13,000 fighting men stood before the walls, with a tail of pilgrims and non-combatants behind them. They were few, they were far from home, and they were about to attempt the hardest thing they had yet tried: the storming of a great walled city defended by a determined garrison in the burning heat of a Palestinian summer, with little water and almost no timber to build the machines they would need. There was also a clock ticking, the same kind of clock that had nearly destroyed them at Antioch. The Fatimid Caliphate would not abandon Jerusalem without a fight. An army was being raised in Egypt and would soon march north to relieve the city. The Crusaders had to take Jerusalem before that army arrived, or they would once again be caught between high walls and a relieving host, this time at the very end of their long road, within sight of the goal they had crossed the world to reach. The final and most famous act of the First Crusade was about to begin, and it would end in a triumph forever shadowed by what the victors did when the walls came down: the fall of Jerusalem. The siege began in the second week of June, 1099, and the Crusaders quickly discovered that taking Jerusalem would be even harder than they had feared. They spread their forces around the city as best their small numbers allowed, with Raymond of Toulouse and his southern French on the side facing Mount Zion, and Godfrey, the two Roberts, and Tancred ranged along the northern walls. But they could not surround the city completely, and they faced two desperate shortages from the very first day. The Fatimid governor had ruined the wells and cisterns for miles around, so the Crusaders, sweltering in the dry heat of a Palestinian June, suffered terribly from thirst, sending parties far afield to fetch water and losing men to ambush as they did. Worse still for an army that needed to break into a walled city, the country around Jerusalem was nearly bare of trees. Without timber there could be no siege towers, no battering rams, no catapults, and without those, the walls were unbreakable. They tried anyway, too soon. In the middle of June, after only a few days, the Crusaders launched a hasty assault with the little equipment they had managed to throw together, including a single scaling ladder. It was hopelessly inadequate. The defenders beat them back easily, and the failure made plain that there would be no quick victory by courage alone. They needed proper engines, and to build them they needed wood and skilled hands, neither of which they had. Salvation arrived, as it had at Antioch, by sea. A small fleet of Genoese and English ships put in at the port of Jaffa, carrying not only food and supplies but craftsmen, tools, ropes, nails and timber. The Crusaders stripped the ships themselves for their wood, and parties ranging deeper into the hills found stands of trees that the local defenders had missed. With these materials and the expertise of the sailors and engineers, the army set to work building the machines that would decide the siege. Over several weeks they constructed two great wooden siege towers, tall enough to overtop the walls, along with a battering ram and stone-throwing engines. The work was done under the summer sun by men short of water and harassed by sorties, but it was done. Before the final assault, the Crusaders turned once more to their faith. A priest reported a vision in which Bishop Adhemar, the beloved leader who had died at Antioch, instructed the army to fast and then to walk in procession around the walls of Jerusalem, and if they did so in true devotion, the city would fall within days. On the 8th of July, the entire host, barefoot and carrying their crosses and relics, walked in solemn procession around the city, while the defenders lined the walls and jeered at them and mocked their symbols. The procession ended at the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit and others preached, and where the quarrelling leaders, Raymond and Godfrey and the rest, were urged to set aside their rivalries and stand together for the final effort. For once, they did. The decisive assault came in the middle of July. On the night before, both armies moved their great siege towers into position, and there was a clever piece of misdirection. The Crusaders shifting Godfrey's tower under cover of darkness to a stretch of the northern wall that the defenders had left less heavily guarded. At dawn, the attack began in earnest and went on through 2 brutal days. The Crusaders pushed their towers against the walls under a storm of arrows and stones, while the defenders hurled down fire flaming pitch and naphtha that clung and burned, trying to set the wooden towers alight. The fighting on the southern wall, where Raymond pressed his attack, made little headway against the strong defences there. But on the north, on the 15th of July, Godfrey's tower at last ground up against the rampart. The Crusaders dropped a wooden bridge from the top of the tower onto the wall, and across it the first attackers scrambled onto the battlements. The chroniclers preserved the names of the first knights over, 2 Flemish brothers, and Godfrey himself was soon among the men gaining a foothold on the wall. Once a few Crusaders held a stretch of the rampart, they fought their way along it, cleared a path, and threw open one of the city gates. Through it the rest of the army poured into Jerusalem, and the defence, which had held so stubbornly for so long, broke apart. The Fatimid governor and his personal guard fell back to the citadel, the strong tower by the western gate, and there he negotiated his surrender to Raymond, handing over the tower and a great sum of treasure in exchange for safe conduct out of the city for himself and his men. He and his guard were among the very few who were allowed to leave alive, for the city had fallen, and what happened next has darkened the memory of the First Crusade for nearly 1,000 years. The Crusaders, after 3 years of suffering, after the desert and the sieges and the deaths of so many of their companions, and now whipped into a frenzy by victory and by their belief that they were reclaiming the holiest place on earth, fell upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem and slaughtered them. They killed Muslims and Jews, fighting men and unarmed civilians, the old, the women, and the children, through the streets and houses of the city. Many of the Muslim inhabitants had taken refuge on the Temple Mount, in and around the great mosque, and there they were cut down in large numbers. The Jewish community of Jerusalem gathered in their synagogue, and it was set ablaze with them inside. The Crusader chroniclers themselves described the killing in terms so extreme, blood flowing through the streets, that later readers struggled to believe them, and modern historians still debate how many thousands truly died, and how much the numbers were exaggerated by writers eager to convey the totality of the conquest. What is not in doubt is that a massacre took place, indiscriminate and prolonged, and that it shocked even some who heard of it at the time. Then the Crusaders did a thing that captures the strange and troubling heart of the whole enterprise. Having drenched the city in blood, the surviving leaders and soldiers, many of them still spattered with it, went in procession to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's tomb and the spiritual goal of their entire pilgrimage. And there they wept and gave thanks to God and prayed in joy and gratitude for the mercy that had brought them to this moment. They saw no contradiction in it. To them they had purified the holy city and recovered it for Christ, and the slaughter was part of that purification. To the Muslim world, and to many who have looked back since, the image of pious men praying in a city they had just filled with the dead became the defining and damning memory of the crusade. The killing at Jerusalem would be remembered in the Islamic East for centuries, a wound that shaped how an entire civilization viewed the Franks who had come out of the West. But the deed was done, and the goal achieved. On the 15th of July, 1099, after a journey of 3 years and 2,000 miles, Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The first time in more than 4 centuries that the city had passed out of Muslim rule. The impossible thing that Urban had called for in a French field had come to pass. Yet a conquered city is not a governed one, and the Crusaders had given almost no thought to what came after victory. Who would rule Jerusalem now? How would a handful of exhausted Westerners hold a city in the middle of a hostile world? And out of Egypt, even now, the Fatimid army was marching north to take back what had been lost. The crusade had reached its goal, but it was not yet over. What the crusade left behind. With Jerusalem taken and the blood barely dry, the Crusaders faced a problem they had spent 3 years ignoring. They had a city and a sliver of conquered land around it, but no government and no agreement on who should lead it. The surviving leaders gathered to choose a ruler. The honour was offered first to Raymond of Toulouse, the senior man, but he declined, saying, "In a gesture that may have been genuine piety, and may have been wounded pride after his eclipse by Bohemond and the collapse of his Holy Lance, that he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Whether anyone truly pressed him is unclear. The choice then fell on Godfrey of Bouillon, the steady, devout duke whose siege tower had first breached the walls, and he accepted. But Godfrey too refused the title of king. He would rule, he said, only as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a protector of the holy places rather than a monarch in the city of Christ. So, the first ruler of Crusader Jerusalem governed without a crown, and a Latin churchman was installed as patriarch to lead the church in the conquered land. There was no time to settle in. Out of Egypt, as expected, came the Fatimid army, a large force under the caliph's powerful vizier, marching north to retake Jerusalem and drive the Franks into the sea. The Crusaders, instead of waiting to be besieged in a city they had only just taken, marched out boldly to meet it. In the middle of August, 1099, near the coastal town of Ascalon, they fell upon the Fatimid host, catching it by surprise before it had properly formed for battle. The fight was sharp, and the Crusader victory was complete. The Egyptian army was scattered, and its camp captured, and the threat to the new conquest was broken. The Battle of Ascalon is usually counted as the end of the First Crusade, the final hammer blow that secured what the Long March had won. Even here, though, the leaders could not stop quarrelling. The town of Ascalon itself was ready to surrender, but only to Raymond, whom its garrison trusted, and Godfrey would not allow his rival that prize. So no one took it, and Ascalon remained in Muslim hands for another half-century, a thorn in the side of the kingdom the Crusaders had just created. It was a fitting final note for an expedition so often hindered by the pride of its own commanders. With the great vow fulfilled and Jerusalem safe for the moment, most of the Crusaders went home. They had sworn to reach the Holy Sepulchre, and they had done it. And now they wanted to return to the families and lands they had left years before. The two Roberts, of Normandy and Flanders, turned back toward Europe, as did Raymond eventually, by way of Constantinople. Only a few thousand chose to remain and hold the new conquests, a tiny Latin garrison clinging to a strip of hostile territory at the far end of the world. It was a dangerously thin foundation on which to build, and yet build they did. Godfrey did not live long to defend his city. He died in the summer of 1100, only about a year after the conquest, and his death raised at once the question he had tried to avoid. His brother Baldwin, the same ambitious younger son who had carved out the county of Edessa, came south to claim the inheritance, and he had no scruples whatsoever about crowns. Baldwin was crowned the first king of Jerusalem, and under him and his successors the conquest became a true kingdom, with a royal court, laws, coinage, and all the machinery of a medieval state transplanted improbably into the Near East. That kingdom was one of 4 Latin states that the First Crusade left scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, a region the Westerners came to call simply the land beyond the sea. There was the county of Edessa in the north, Baldwin's first creation. There was the Principality of Antioch, the domain Bohemond had schemed so hard to win. There was the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south, and there would soon be a fourth, the county of Tripoli, established along the coast by Raymond of Toulouse and his heirs in the years that followed. Together these states made up a Latin Christian presence in the Muslim East that would endure, in shrinking and embattled form, for nearly 2 centuries, until the last of them was extinguished with the fall of Acre near the end of the 1200s. The leaders themselves met varied ends. Bohemond, the cunning Norman who had given up Jerusalem for Antioch, was soon captured by the Turks and spent years as a prisoner before being ransomed. He never recovered his early brilliance, returned to Europe, launched a war against his old adversary, the Emperor Alexios, and lost it, dying without the great kingdom he had always dreamed of. Raymond of Toulouse spent his final years building the foundations of Tripoli and died before the city itself was taken. Peter the Hermit, the strange preacher who had set the first doomed wave in motion, survived it all, went home to Europe, founded a monastery, and died quietly in his bed, which is more than could be said for the tens of thousands who had followed him. The deeper consequences of the First Crusade reach far beyond the lives of these men. It was, as it happened, the only one of the great crusades to fully achieve its goal. The expeditions that followed over the next 2 centuries, launched again and again to defend or recover the Holy Land, would mostly end in failure, frustration, or disaster, which only made the memory of this first improbable success shine brighter in the Western imagination. The crusade enormously enhanced the prestige and authority of the papacy, proving that a pope could summon and direct the energies of all Christendom. It opened a long era of holy war and gave birth to new institutions, including the famous military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, brotherhoods of warrior monks who arose to protect the pilgrims and defend the new states. It also reshaped the wider world in ways no one at Clermont could have foreseen. The Italian merchant cities that had ferried supplies and soldiers, Genoa, Pisa, and above all Venice, won trading privileges in the eastern ports that helped make them the commercial powers of the coming age. And the contact between East and West quickened the flow of goods, ideas, and knowledge in both directions. The relationship between the Latin West and Byzantium, never warm, curdled into lasting bitterness, the mutual suspicions born at Constantinople and hardened at Antioch festering for generations, until a later crusade, in the early 1200s, would turn aside from the Holy Land altogether and sack Constantinople itself, a Christian army destroying the greatest Christian city in the world. And in the Muslim East, the conquest of Jerusalem and the slaughter that came with it left a wound that did not heal. In time, it helped inspire a counter-movement, a gathering of Muslim strength under leaders who preached the recovery of the Holy City, culminating most famously in Saladin, who would retake Jerusalem near the end of the same century. So the thing that began with an old man's words in a French field meant at first only to send a few mercenaries to help a worried emperor reclaim some farmland, grew into one of the most consequential undertakings of the medieval world. It moved hundreds of thousands of people, killed a great many of them, founded kingdoms, ruined a friendship between two halves of Christendom, enriched merchant cities, frightened and then galvanized the Islamic world, and fixed in the Western mind an idea of holy war that would echo for centuries. The men and women who walked that long road did not understand the forces they had set in motion, and they could not have. They believed they were on a pilgrimage to save their souls and recover the city of God. What they actually did was change the shape of the world, and not always in the ways they intended, and seldom in the ways they hoped. And that is the story of the First Crusade, from a quiet request for help to the storming of Jerusalem and the long shadow it cast afterward. If you are still awake, there is another video waiting for you on the screen whenever you feel ready to keep the journey going. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought down in the comments. There is no rush. For now, set everything aside, rest easy, and let yourself settle. Close your eyes and let the day go. Sleep well, and sweet dreams